We think of the Mongols as conquerors and warriors. What rarely gets spoken of is what followed once the siege towers fell silent. When the arrows stopped flying and the city gates shattered, that's when the true nightmare began. Not for the men left lifeless in the streets. Their suffering had ended. It was their wives, their daughters, their mothers. Every woman who survived the initial assault who faced something far worse. What the Mongols inflicted on them made death seem like mercy. You believe you understand Mongol brutality. The chronicles barely dare to hint at what came next. If you're interested in documented history from the Mongol conquests, make sure to subscribe. It helps us continue this work. Let us know in the comments which city you are watching from. All of this is grounded in sources from Persian chroniclers, Chinese records, and archaeological excavations across Central Asia. Now, back to the story. The city of Nishapur fell to the Mongol horde in April of 1221. The siege lasted only 10 days. When the walls were finally breached, Genghis Khan's army poured through like a flood of iron and fury. The Persian chronicler Juvayni records that 1.7 million people lived in Nishapur before the Mongols arrived. After they left, the city was silent. Every building reduced to rubble. Every street stained with blood. But the written chronicles stopped there, falling into careful silence about what happened to the women. Archaeological evidence fills that silence. Excavations conducted in the 1960s and again in 2004 uncovered mass graves on the outskirts of where Nishapur once stood. The remains tell a story the chroniclers couldn't write. Of the 847 skeletons recovered from one burial site, 612 were female. But these weren't T-battle casualties killed quickly in the chaos of invasion. The bones showed deliberate patterns. Pelvic fractures consistent with prolonged assault. Wrist bones shattered from being restrained. Vertebrae compressed from being forced into submission positions for extended periods. The forensic analysis revealed something even more disturbing. Based on the bone density and calcium depletion patterns, these women had survived in captivity for weeks, possibly months after the city fell. They weren't killed in the heat of conquest. They were kept alive, used systematically, and then eliminated when they served no further purpose. But Nishapur was not an isolated incident. It was the pattern. Mongol military strategy had a calculated component that most history books conveniently omit. When a city surrendered without resistance, the population was generally spared and incorporated into the empire. But when a city chose to fight, when it dared to kill even a single Mongol warrior, the retribution followed a precise formula, and women were not collateral damage in that formula. They were the primary target. The Chronicle of Novgorod describes what happened when the Mongols took the Russian city of Ryazan in 1237. After 5 days of resistance, the city fell. The chronicle states that the Mongol commander ordered all males over the age of 12 executed immediately. Merciful, by comparison to what followed. The women were divided into categories: young girls, married women, widows, pregnant women. Widows, pregnant women. Each category had a designated fate, carefully organized by Mongol officers. Archaeological surveys of medieval Ryazan, now buried beneath modern construction, revealed something that corroborates the written accounts. Foundation excavations in 1975 uncovered what researchers initially thought was a warehouse district. But the structure was wrong. The buildings had no windows. The doors could only be locked from the outside, and the drainage systems carved into the stone floors weren't for merchandise or grain storage. They were for human waste. These were holding facilities, processing centers for human cargo. The Mongols hadn't just conquered Ryazan, they had transformed it into a distribution hub for enslaved women. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings and preserved wooden posts, dates the construction of these facilities to within months of the city's fall. The Mongols built them immediately, as part of their occupation infrastructure. This wasn't spontaneous brutality. This was organized industry. Chinese sources from the Song dynasty provide even more explicit details. The scholar Peng Daya, writing in 1237, described Mongol military camps after successful sieges. He documented the existence of what he called selection pavilions, temporary structures where captured women were brought for examination. Mongol officers would inspect them like livestock. The young and attractive were marked for officers. The strong were designated for labor camps. The rest were given to common soldiers as rewards for valor in battle. But Peng Daya's account includes a detail so horrifying that later scholars suspected it was propaganda, until archaeological evidence proved it true. He wrote that women who resisted or attempted escape were subjected to public punishment designed not just to kill them, but to terrorize the others into compliance. The punishment was called the Mongol flower. The victim's limbs were broken in multiple places, but carefully, so major blood vessels remained intact. They were then bent backward and bound in a position that resembled a blooming flower. Death came slowly, over hours or days, from shock and organ failure. The display served as a permanent reminder to all other captives of what defiance would bring. Excavations at the site of ancient Kaifeng in China uncovered physical evidence of this practice. In 2011, researchers found a mass burial pit containing 23 female skeletons with identical injury patterns. Every major bone showed deliberate fractures. The positioning of the remains suggested they had been bound in contorted positions before death. Soil analysis indicated they had been left exposed for extended periods before burial, consistent with the practice of public display described in the Chinese chronicles. The scope of Mongol systematic violence against women becomes clear when you examine the demographic data. Population studies across conquered territories show a consistent pattern. Before Mongol invasion, most cities maintained roughly balanced gender ratios, sometimes with slight female majorities due to male casualties in local conflicts. After Mongol occupation, the ratio shifted dramatically. In some regions, historical records indicate female populations dropped by 60 to 70%. Where did they go? The answer lies in the slave routes. The Mongols established the most efficient human trafficking network the medieval world had ever seen. The Silk Road, celebrated in history books as a route for trade and cultural exchange, also served as a highway for enslaved people. Women captured in Central Asian cities were marched to markets in Samarkand. Those taken in Persia ended up in Baghdad or Damascus. Chinese captives were distributed throughout the empire, from Korea to the Black Sea. Arabic chroniclers like Ibn al-Athir documented the scale. Writing about the fall of Merv in 1221, he recorded that the Mongols spent 13 days in the city after its surrender. 13 days of organized selection and sorting. By the time they left, al-Athir estimates that over 100,000 women had been distributed among the troops or marked for transport to slave markets. He notes that the Mongols maintained detailed records, carved wooden tablets listing names, ages, and destinations. Some of these tablets have survived. Preserved in the dry climate of the Taklamakan Desert, they were discovered by Chinese archaeologists in 1998. The tablets are chilling in their bureaucratic precision. They list women like inventory items. 12 females, age 14 to 20, designated for Officer Corps, Western Garrison. 47 females, age 20-35, marked for labor detail, Karakoram construction project. 8 females pregnant, holding status pending. That last category reveals another dimension of horror. Mongol law, as recorded in the Yasa, the legal code established by Genghis Khan, had specific provisions regarding pregnant captives. If the child was determined to be Mongol, the woman would be spared and elevated to a higher status within the slave hierarchy. If the child was clearly not Mongol, both mother and infant were eliminated. The determination was made immediately after birth. There was no appeal, no mercy, no exception. Mass graves discovered near the ruins of Herat in Afghanistan in 2007 contained evidence of this practice. Among the 134 female skeletons recovered, 31 showed signs of having died during or immediately after childbirth. But there were only 7 infant remains in the entire burial site. The other 24 babies simply disappeared from the archaeological record. The implication is clear and horrifying. They were removed, disposed of separately, evidence erased. But forced pregnancy was only one aspect of the systematic violence. The Mongols employed rape as a weapon of conquest in ways that went beyond individual brutality. It was policy. The Armenian chronicler Karakos Ganzaketsi, writing in the 1260s, described Mongol tactics during the invasion of Armenia. After taking a fortress or town, Mongol commanders would identify the local leadership, noble families, wealthy merchants. Their wives and daughters were then publicly assaulted in front of them. A calculated psychological destruction designed to break not just individuals but entire social structures. The message was clear. Your power means nothing. Your honor is worthless. Your God cannot protect you. By violating the women of the elite in public view, the Mongols destroyed the very foundation of medieval social order, which was built on concepts of honor, protection, and patriarchal authority. Once a man had been forced to watch his family violated while powerless to intervene, he was broken in a way that no torture of his own body could accomplish. Georgian chronicles describe similar tactics used during the Mongol invasions of the Caucasus in the 1220s. The Queen Rusudin of Georgia wrote desperate letters to the Pope, pleading for help against invaders who were, in her words, demons who delight in the destruction of Christian virtue. Her letters describe Mongol forces deliberately targeting convents and monasteries, places where women had sought refuge believing religious sanctity would protect them. The Mongols proved that no place was sacred, no vow of chastity respected, no promise of protection honored. Archaeological excavations at the site of the Gelati Monastery in Georgia uncovered evidence supporting Queen Rusudin's accounts. In the chapel crypt, researchers found the remains of 67 women and girls, all showing signs of violent death. But the most disturbing detail was the positioning of the bodies. They had been carefully arranged in a circle, facing inward, around a central point where a religious icon had once stood. This wasn't random killing, it was theatrical, a deliberate desecration designed to mock Christian beliefs and terrorize survivors. The Mongol approach to conquered women wasn't driven by uncontrolled lust or spontaneous violence. It was a calculated tool of imperial expansion. By systematically destroying the social fabric of conquered societies through sexual violence, they ensured that resistance would be minimal. Populations broken in this way rarely rebelled. They were too traumatized, too ashamed, too psychologically shattered to organize effective resistance. Russian chronicles describe how this strategy played out in practice. After the Mongol conquest of Rus principalities in 1237 to 1240, the region descended into what chroniclers called the Time of Silence. For decades, Russian historical records contain almost no mention of women in positions of influence or authority. No marriages of noble families are recorded. No property transfers involving women appear in legal documents. It's as if an entire gender had been erased from the historical record. Modern historians initially attributed this to gaps in surviving documents. But genetic studies conducted in the 21st century revealed a different truth. DNA analysis of modern Russian populations shows a significant influx of Central Asian genetic markers dating precisely to the Mongol occupation period. But but the pattern is specific. These markers appear almost exclusively in mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to child. This means the genetic transfer came through women, not men, and it came in sufficient volume to leave a permanent imprint on the population. The implications are staggering. The Mongols didn't just conquer and leave. They fundamentally altered the genetic makeup of entire regions through systematic sexual violence continued over generations. The women who survived, who bore children from their captors, became unwilling agents of genetic imperialism. Their descendants, raised in broken families in conquered lands, carried within their very DNA the evidence of their ancestors' suffering. But some women refused to become victims. The chronicles of Li Dynasty Korea describe a woman named Lady Shou, captured during the Mongol invasion of 1231. She was taken to a military camp where Mongol officers had gathered several dozen Korean noblewomen for distribution. According to the chronicle, Lady Shou waited until night, then used a ceramic shard to kill 3 guards before freeing herself and 7 other women. They escaped to the mountains, where they survived for 2 months before reaching Korean-held territory. The chronicle describes Lady Shou's testimony about what she witnessed in the Mongol camp. Women chained in rows, guarded day and night. Daily selections where some were taken away, never to return. And worse, the systematic breaking of captive spirits through starvation, exposure, and constant threat of violence. She described how some women, unable to endure, would take their own lives by any means available, hanging themselves with strips of fabric, drowning in water troughs, even bashing their heads against stone walls. The Mongols adapted their practices based on the culture they were conquering. In Islamic regions, they weaponized religious law against women. The Persian historian Rashid al-Din documents how Mongol commanders would force captured Muslim women to violate Sharia law, making them consume alcohol, removing their veils, or compelling them to participate in acts that would render them impure by Islamic standards. This served a dual purpose: satisfying the captors while simultaneously destroying the women's status within their own communities, ensuring they could never truly return home, even if freed. In China, the Mongols exploited Confucian concepts of filial piety and family honor. Chinese sources describe how Mongol officers would capture entire families, then force family members to witness or participate in each other's degradation. A father compelled to watch his daughter's assault. A son forced to choose which family member would be spared. This deliberate destruction of family bonds ensured that even survivors were psychologically destroyed, unable to reconstruct the social relationships that had previously defined their identity. The long-term effects rippled through generations. Studies of historical records from post-Mongol societies show elevated rates of domestic violence, family breakdown, and social dysfunction that persisted for over a century after the initial conquests. The trauma wasn't just individual. It became embedded in the cultural memory of entire civilizations. By 1260, the Mongol Empire had reached its maximum extent, controlling territory from Korea to Hungary. Within that vast domain lived millions of women whose lives had been fundamentally altered by Mongol conquest. Some lived in permanent captivity. Others had been married to Mongol soldiers through forced unions that local law was compelled to recognize. Still others had survived and returned home, only to face rejection from communities that viewed them as contaminated. The slave markets of Samarkand, documented by travelers like William of Rubruck in 1253, operated openly and efficiently. Women were displayed in sections organized by age and origin. Prices were standardized. A young woman from a noble family commanded premium rates. A peasant girl sold for less than a horse. Pregnant women were discounted. Those over 30, unless they possessed special skills, were often deemed worthless and abandoned to die. The market infrastructure was sophisticated, buildings specifically designed for holding human cargo, inspection rooms where buyers could verify their purchases, even return policies that allowed dissatisfied purchasers to exchange slaves within a certain period. The Mongols had industrialized human trafficking on a scale the world hadn't seen before, and wouldn't see again until the Atlantic slave trade centuries later. But the most haunting evidence comes from burial practices. Across the former Mongol Empire, archaeologists have discovered anomalous graves. Female bodies buried with their hands still bound. Skeletons interred without any grave goods or markers, as if the deceased were deliberately meant to be forgotten. Mass burials where women's remains show evidence of systematic violence but no signs of battle trauma, indicating they were killed after the fighting ended, not during it. One excavation near Bukhara in Uzbekistan revealed something that shocked researchers. A burial pit containing over 200 female skeletons, all showing signs of violent death, all wearing the remnants of similar clothing. Fragments of silk that analysis showed were dyed with expensive pigments. These weren't peasants or soldiers. They were noble women, possibly from across different conquered territories, brought together and executed in a single location. Why? The only explanation that fits the evidence is that they had served their purpose and were being disposed of to eliminate witnesses or potential sources of future resistance. The Mongol conquest changed the world in ways that history books celebrate, connecting East and West, spreading technology and ideas, creating the largest contiguous land empire in human history. But beneath those achievements lies a darker truth, written not in chronicles but in bones, in DNA, in the demographic scars that still mark regions conquered 7 centuries ago. Stand at the ruins of any major city that fell to the Mongols, and the silence is profound. Not because nothing happened there, but because what happened was so thoroughly erased. The women who suffered, who survived, who died, their stories were deliberately omitted from official histories, deemed too shameful or too controversial to preserve. But archaeology doesn't lie. Bones don't forget, and genetic evidence carries testimony across centuries. The Mongols conquered half the known world, but their greatest victory wasn't military. It was the successful erasure of their systematic atrocities against women from historical memory. For 700 years, we've celebrated Genghis Khan as a great unifier and brilliant strategist, while the millions of women who suffered under his empire remained nameless, faceless, unremembered. Until now, because every excavation reveals more. Every genetic study confirms what the chroniclers were too afraid to write. What the Mongols did to the women of conquered cities wasn't war. It was systematic destruction of humanity itself, one captive at a time. And the fact that we were only now beginning to fully acknowledge it reveals something